Subscribe to our YouTube channel and don't forget to press the bell icon to get all the latest updates. Prime Minister Narendra Modi has spoken out on the loss of lives of our gallant soldiers, 20 of them at least dying in the line of duty, battered with stones and iron rods by Chinese troops. The Prime Minister has said that this sacrifice will not go in vain. China is now making noises about not wanting further escalation, but several key questions remain. The big question, of course, is if the Chinese are still squatting on Indian territory and the LAC's sanctity has been disturbed, where do we go from here? Is there a limited war that we are potentially looking at, or will the response have to be economic? Or could diplomacy still save the day? What about public pressure, political pressure? There are all kinds of factors that go in to a response being constructed at a sensitive moment like this. The Prime Minister has called for an all-party meeting as well later this week. Now, joining us on the program, the special broadcast, the former Army Chief, General Ved Malik. We're also joined by General Hasnain, military veteran, one of our important military analysts. And we have Dr. Sanjaya, who has, of course, served in government and apart from being a very senior journalist and knows a thing or two about how to handle and manage a crisis. General Malik, it's a very, very tragic 24 hours for the Indian Army. The commanding officer has led from the front in the best tradition and the best ethos of the Army. But questions are going to be raised, sir. Our men went in unarmed. They went in good faith. They thought they were supervising or executing a withdrawal by the Chinese troops. There are already many in the military establishment who are saying, what would make a soldier go into an area like this without arms? Because we now have reasonable information that this was a good faith exercise by the Indians, which was reneged on by the Chinese.
Yes, you are right. And I think it's a correct question also to be asked, because soldiers are not expected to go into adversary unarmed. In fact, I have myself been thinking that why have we reached a situation where troops get into scuffle with each other? That is stone pelting and the brandishing of wooden sticks and barbed wire, etc., etc. So I think we must review now our SOPs that we do not permit our soldiers to come into hand-to-hand scuffle or fights with each other. So I presume that hereafter, now this incident has taken place, there will be a revision of the SOPs. And I hope we will not expect them to. Unfortunately, this has been the practice. When we have resolved our problems at Depsang or at other places, including Dokulam, etc. So this has become a practice, but I don't think that is the correct practice for the troops to go and talk to each other without arms and get into a situation where they can get into a scuffle. That must be avoided, and I hope the SOPs will be corrected soon after.
General Malik, before I open this up, where do we go from here? There are many details that are not available to the public. And certainly as an old-timer journalist, I don't want to speculate. But we have no official word on whether there were Chinese casualties. We have the Indian Army talking about casualties on both sides, but we don't know what really happened to the Chinese, except for a very vague statement by the Chinese mouthpiece, the Global Times. We do not yet know how many of our soldiers are seriously injured. We know many of them are at the hospital in Leh. This is apart from the 20 of those who have been martyred. Should we at this point as people be asking the government for more information, or is this a moment to give the government and the military space and lay off the questions? As a journalist and as an Indian, I find this a confusing dilemma. Do we demand to know more at this point, or do we just let things be for a day or two?
No, I think it's fair to demand some more information, particularly after this incident has taken place. And I also believe that the government has noticed this requirement. And therefore, Prime Minister has decided to have an all-party meeting and speak to them about whatever has happened. We could have been a little more forthcoming in speaking to the journalists or talking to them about what is exactly happened. We don't have to diverge our plans, etc. Coming to this particular situation part, the military pressure has to continue. While the political level dialogue has now started, the foreign minister has started speaking to his counterpart in China. That will continue. But in all this dialogue that is taking place or will take place in the next few days, our first demand has to be that the Chinese must vacate that area which they have occupied on our side of the line of actual control. That has to be the most important demand. And unless they go back from there, I see no solution except that again a skirmish can take place. I won't call it a limited war kind of situation, but a localized situation can definitely take place unless the Chinese go back to their original position, that is of April 2020, on their side of the line of actual control. So that has to be the most important issue. And after that, they can discuss as to how to avoid such incidents that they don't take place. And as far as that part is concerned, I think my concern has always been, and this is what I have always stated, that unless you delineate the line of actual control on the maps, including the disputed areas, pending final boundary solution, you will continue to have the kind of skirmishes that have taken place in the recent past. Earlier, they were without any arms. Now they are taking place with stone pelting and all kinds of wooden clubs and things of this nature, which are also taking lives. So that has to be avoided under all circumstances.
General Atta Hasnain, when we spoke a couple of weeks ago, you were much more sanguine. You felt that this was a long haul, sort of simmering tension. I don't know if you ever imagined that it would erupt like this. Given that it has erupted, given that Indian soldiers have been clubbed, it makes me upset even to say this word, but clubbed by the Chinese on Indian soil. It is difficult for any government to basically say we're still going to try diplomacy, even if that is the wise option, that is the pragmatic option, and that is the required option, right? There's also the issue of the morale of the troops. A CO has led from the front. Down the line, Paltan is going to be feeling something. There are more than 100 men injured at the hospital in Leh. What would you do? What would you do if you were in charge of that area today, Atta Hasnain?
See, Barkha, as you said, about 3 weeks ago, I did predict that this is not going to end so soon. At that time also, I always felt concerned about the rules of engagement, which I found were very, very nebulous, because we never found our patrols actually going out fully armed. They went with that intent of actually just showing their presence and carrying out frag drills and things of that nature. After Doklam, a lot of things have changed. There's no doubt about it. I strongly feel that the Chinese continue to feel that they suffered a huge image deficit during Doklam, after which the Indian Army was seen to be a superior, better at jostling and things like that. Not necessarily military activities, but it was definitely ego deflation for the PLA. And therefore, something was going to be in the offing. And that's exactly what has happened. First on the 5th of May, and now very unexpectedly. I would continue to say very unexpectedly. But I would say there's a complete requirement to change the rules of engagement, and we have to infuse confidence back in our troops. If I was in command at this time, I would definitely be deploying my troops in strength right there. But I would at the same time be very pragmatic that if diplomatic posturing is to take place at this time, then there must be a separation between the troops of the PLA and the Indian Army. If there's a need for us to carry out any confirmation, any kind of verification of the de-escalation process, then there's a need for establishing hotline contact. I'm surprised that actually a hotline contact was not established at any of the points. It seemed that the whole process was being undergone by sending a commanding officer with his party physically to the ground to verify, convince the Chinese to leave and things like that. Obviously with the temperatures high, this kind of a thing would happen. I would slightly disagree with my very revered and and very respected Chief General Ved Malik, I would say at this time, we must hold our horses as far as information is concerned. I would wait for the all-party meeting on the 19th, because I think it is not fair to share information with the public without having shared it politically with the opposition and things like that. Thereafter, after having taken complete political consensus, then the necessary actions which are contemplated may be shared partially with the public. I see a long haul continuing for the moment. I don't see this resolving itself, but I strongly feel that the Indian Army must change its rules of engagement and must be prepared at all costs to regain that area which apparently seems to be lost, may not be entirely lost, but we have to be prepared as we were prepared in Kargil after the initial storm had broken out.
Dr. Baru, let me ask you first about the information warfare dimension of this, because I know General Malik has been making the point since yesterday that we live in the age of information warfare, and often our information narrative management is not effective and we lose out on that. General Hasnain believes that we can step back, we can tell journalists right now, hold your horses. Most journalists actually, and you know this, you know from your time as media advisor to Dr. Manmohan Singh, that if you picked up the phone and you called India's top 20 journalists and you said, we need you to stand with the country right now, each one of us would just zip up and be quiet. The problem is, I'm not sure that interface is taking place, and that's why there's masses of speculation and masses of contradictory information that is coming out. Now, first, let's talk about how the government should message this crisis, because it is a crisis for them and they need effective messaging.
Well, first of all, it's good to be with you. I really admire what you've been doing over the past month or so, and more power to you. Thank you for having me on your discussion today. You know, right through the first term of Prime Minister Modi, many journalists have asked me the question that you asked me, to comment on the communication strategy, the media strategy of Prime Minister Modi, and I consistently refused to do so. I said I do not want to comment on what whoever my successors are is doing this. But in the last couple of months, I have actually written a couple of columns expressing my views, and I don't mind saying this, that I think Prime Minister Modi's media strategy, both to COVID and the lockdown, and now with respect to China and the clashes, have been a disaster. I am really surprised that for someone who's such a master communicator, as a political leader, I mean, he has demonstrated his ability to communicate to the people of India again and again, the ability of the government to get across vital information, whether it was on the coronavirus and the imposition of the lockdown earlier, and today on dealing with a very, very difficult situation on the border. I'm really surprised. I'm finally happy that today the Prime Minister came on television and spoke briefly. But he's coming and saying this after a long time. His speech is already rhetoric without substance. And I'm hoping that after his meeting with the opposition leaders, the government would be able to. I agree with you that a strategy of communication, a planned strategy of communication is vital to the success of any policy effort, whether it's in the area of public health, whether it's in the area of national security. And it is amazing that such a planned strategy of communication has been missing. I hope what has now happened will wake up the government to the need for competent and very credible communication strategy.
Now, let me ask you, Dr. Baru, those are strong words, and I think someone needed to say it, and I'm glad you have. But let me ask you this. In the armory that India has to respond to China, it is my understanding as a layperson, not as a specialist, that we may have to deploy economic responses more than military ones. And the Chinese nature of imperialism has also been more economic. It is able to use Pakistan as a vassal state. You and I were exchanging some tweets earlier where I said Pakistan's the puppet, China is the puppeteer. Have we misassessed the fact that China is a much more lethal adversary for India than Pakistan?
See, first of all, my view on Pakistan is very different. I think Pakistan is very much an internal problem for India, in the sense that it's the legacy of partition. And that will not go away. How we deal with Pakistan has a very, very different game. Pakistan has been willing to lend itself to the highest bidder for the last 70 years. They were willing to go with the United States against India. They were willing to go with Great Britain against India. So Pakistan is willing to lend itself to whoever is paying money. I mean, I don't want to use unparliamentary words, but you know what I'm talking about. And today the person paying that money to Pakistan is China. So they are now the willing, supplicants of China. The real problem is China. And part of the reason is this huge power differential that has emerged, particularly in the last 15, 20 years. It was not so significant before that. You asked me the question about economic boycott. The economic boycott already started. I think already there's a very high level of anti-China sentiment among the consumers in this country. It will only increase thanks to what has happened in the last 24 hours. The biggest concern I have is that over the last 7 years, in fact, I would say probably last 2-3 decades, we have tried hard to build some level of trust between India and China. And I think what has happened in the last couple of years, particularly at Doklam and now this Galwan Valley, is that trust is broken. It will take a lot of effort to restore trust. And ordinary Indians today, I've never seen such a strong anti-China sentiment among ordinary Indians. Yeah. For a long time, even after 62, we are willing to say Hindi bye-bye. Today, nobody will say Hindi chini bye-bye. Absolutely. So I think the Chinese have created a problem for themselves. They are driving us into the armed West. It is, in my judgment, India should continue to make position of independent foreign policy as a civilizational power, as a civilizational state. We are a proud people. We are not going to toe anybody's line. We are not like Pakistan falling into one camp or another. But if we have no option, when the China, we had no option but to go to the United States for help, right? So I don't think it's in India's interest that we get pushed into going into other people's arms. The Chinese have to understand, if they don't understand this, then they are creating a huge alliance, global alliance against China, Japan, Australia, United States, Europe, France. They are creating a problem for themselves and leaving us with no options.
Okay. Now I want to understand, I want to break the conversation into two separate bits. What should happen militarily? What should happen economically? So General Malik, militarily, what are the options available to the military on the ground? And let me remind all of our viewers that we are upon the anniversary of Kargil, and there is some sense of deja vu here. There is some sense of the Chinese having ingressed, trying to take control of the heights. Soldiers who control the heights, control the strategic advantage. There is a sense of very hostile terrain. There is the mountains as a backdrop of a battlefield are not easy for any fighting force, no matter how accomplished our men is. All of this, you led the country in Kargil. Are we in a Kargil-like situation with China? Is a Kargil-like situation upon us, General Malik?
Barka, if I have your permission, I would like to say a word about our communication
yes, please.
Strategy. Now, I don't know why we are not learning from our past experiences. If you remember, during Kargil war, and also when we brought down a maritime reconnaissance plane of the Pakistan Navy, that time also we started having joint briefing by the External Affairs Joint Secretary with an army officer and a naval officer, and this was a routine affair. After some time, it became a routine affair. And then we didn't have many questions coming. Not many people even wanted to go to except for people like you, not many people went to the border. But that kind of experience, why have we forgotten? When there is a crisis situation of the kind that has now taken place, we should have come out like that and brief the media as well as somebody else who wanted on the actual situation. We don't have to diverge any plans, etc. on that. That is as far as the communication part is concerned. Now, the second question, which is an important question. Firstly, I think we cannot compare what happened in Kargil to what has happened here. Kargil, we had a long, large frontage, almost about 160 kilometers, the political objective, the military objective of Pakistan were quite different at that time. What has happened at the moment, Galwan Valley in that area, is that this whole situation is a local situation which has, of course, and there is a likelihood of escalation to other areas also. I won't deny that.
Yeah.
So therefore, as I always say, that as far as China is concerned, we should not accept their kahani, we should see their karni on the ground. What is the situation which is being created for us on the ground? The kind of situation they are creating now, particularly in the last 2-3 years, I think we have no alternative except to deploy in large strength our troops, whether they are in high altitude area or other areas. And if this situation is not resolved to the acceptance of both the parties, I have a feeling we will turn the LSC into LOC-like situation, where there is a much greater troops, and they are both occupying heights, and there are occasional skirmishes or battles that are taking place. So we need to avoid that. I think that is in the interest of both the countries.
Yeah.
If they do not agree, and as I said, if the LSC is not delineated on the maps,
Yeah.
which will be the first step of avoiding such a conflict. Otherwise, the LSC may become like the LOC with Pakistan.
That's a very important point. And General Hasnain, I just want to add one point of my own before you respond. We've had deaths on 3 borders this past week, right? We've had a hot LOC. We've had what's happened at the LAC, the line of actual control, and we've had what's happened with Nepal. And actually, in some ways, the dots do join to China, because, you know, you can't actually talk of Pakistan anymore in isolation of the Chinese patronage and the Chinese sort of umbrella cover. You have China pushing its influence in Nepal. And, you know, so there is China as a common factor. But when General Malik says that the LAC could become like the LOC, that is an alarming situation, especially because the LAC is not delineated like the LOC is. And there is nothing, you know, it is an agreement. It is an agreement between 2 countries, but it's not a mapped agreement. Now, surely the minimum India will expect at this point is a final deal on the LAC, on the contours of the LAC. Is that a practical hope for the moment we're in?
Barkha, firstly, let me agree with everything that General Malik has just said. And as to your question, the last question, whether it's a fair one to expect that the LAC will finally get delineated and that will be the beginning of a resolution of issues with China, let me say my plain answer is no, it is not going to happen. Because the Chinese have a strategy in place. They want to keep the LAC nebulous all along, because that helps them, as I said, as a part of the grand strategy and the overall diplomatic posturing. They want to ensure that India remains focused on the Himalayan belt, that there is always forever a threat, persistent threat, which is there on the northern borders of India. This is primarily to take away our focus essentially from the maritime domain, the maritime zone where the actual threats to Chinese security lie. And that is something that they have succeeded in doing. So to actually start delineating the LAC and resolving the LAC and start having a looking at a solution, potential solution to the border issue, I don't think China is going to play to that. It's not going to play to China's strategy at all. As to this issue of the LAC becoming the LOC, I think that is the prime fear that exists today. We don't have the kind of resources. We have got a very large army, there's no doubt of there's some downscaling taking place at this time, but this is a remote border. And I'd like to remind your viewers, Kargil was still comparatively not as remote. This is hugely remote. It's right across the Ladakh range. It is right in the bang of the middle of the Karakoram range. It is not an area which is friendly in winter at all. I have lived there in winter. I've traveled around in winter, and I can assure you it's not an easy thing to do. So we have very little time, in fact, this year in the remaining portion of the campaigning season. But when looking at the situation, I cannot think of any other option but to deploy, dig in, and keep your powder keg dry, absolutely, because The street view and the street option is very clear. 3 borders, loss of lives on all 3 borders. The public is definitely restive. The government is going to be under pressure. And obviously, some kind of a middle ground will have to be achieved in this. It's not that we can completely switch off and say everything will be diplomatic and hope like hell that it will get resolved. No, there will have to be some military posturing. There will have to be some military coercion. There will be a continuing standoff at this time. And I don't foresee something resolving any time in this campaigning season till the month of October, November.
But you do see, therefore, General Hasnain, you do see a military escalation or retaliation in the short term from India.
But Barka, we are at the moment concentrating only on Galwan, remember. And Galwan was not such a contentious issue. The more contentious issue is at the Pangong Tso, where the fingers are. And your viewers need to know that the fingers area actually gives an operational tactical advantage to the Chinese. Both directions, towards the north and the northern bank of the Pangong Tso and towards the southern bank of the Pangong Tso. It's not a piece of ground which India can just wish away in this manner. And I don't foresee that our senior commanders are going to be happy doing that in any way.
Dr. Baru, but in real terms, you are, there is the shadow of 1962 over us. There is the economic sort of hegemony, as it were, of China. There is the trade deficit that India has with China. There are people beyond the emotionalism of the street who are going to argue that whatever you do now, you have to do to win. You can't go in on an emotion to lose more ground, to lose more men. Honor is a big thing, but revenge is best served cold. What are the options before India? Sir, just unmute yourself. Dr. Baru, unmute yourself.
Sorry. Yeah, there are several options. There are, of course, the diplomatic options, which we have been engaged in, building a stronger relationship with the range of other countries, which are equally worried. Don't forget that in the last week or 10 days, China has been exerting pressure on Japan, on Vietnam, on Taiwan, on range of countries in its neighborhood. So it's in Southeast Asia and Indonesia. So, the Chinese assertiveness is regional. It's not only in India. And therefore, there is great concern about China's assertiveness across this entire Asia-Pacific or Indo-Pacific region. And that is why we have been working with them. And I think we have made some mistakes in weakening our interaction. For example, I have been a critic of this government's decision to withdraw from the RC, the Regional Economic Partnership Agreement, because we need to engage the ASEAN region. And I'm very happy to see the former Foreign Secretary, Vijay Gokhale, write a column recently making the same point, that we need to revive our conversation with the ASEAN countries, with Japan, with Korea, with Taiwan, towards a closer economic engagement. So diplomacy...
Seb, sorry to interrupt you, but wouldn't the RCEP give an effective free trade agreement to China?
No, you see, first of all, let the negotiations finish, but I don't think we should have walked out of the negotiation. We can defend our interests, we can bargain till the end, but we should have been involved in the bargaining. And I'm not fully convinced that all the other countries would be willing to accept an unfair deal from China as well. So there is a lot of concern about China's economic arm twisting in the entire region. We are not the only ones worried about this. But I think diplomatic engagement through trade negotiations, through maritime exercises, the creation of the Quad, etc., all the recent summit meeting with the Australian Prime Minister was extremely important. So there is a diplomatic engagement, and I think that should get a greater fillip. But secondly, on the economic side, I do now think that, worrying about the trade deficit, I don't think there's any point now. China is not going to address it. I think Mr. Suresh Prabhu made the point recently that he tried to negotiate. There was a willingness at that time. The Chinese were willing to negotiate, but now they've stopped. I don't think after Mahabalipuram, there's any confidence in India that the Chinese are willing to address the trade deficit issue. But there is the whole issue of the consumption of China-made goods in India. And I think that is something which is now getting a lot of attention. People are buying Chinese goods. There will be a boycott of Chinese goods. I think on the Huawei issue, we went through a long process of discussion and debate over the last several years. I think now our mind should be made up, no Huawei in India. So a lot of tough decisions on the economic side will have to be taken to exert pressure on China. Because what has now happened, the killing of 20 Indian soldiers, is not acceptable.
Of course. Of course. All right. The last comments from General Hasnain, and General Malik can wrap it up for us. General Hasnain, where do we go from here? Dr. Baru has listed a series of economic calibrations that could take place immediately, right? What's going to happen on the ground? If it's long haul, you're entering in a few months, winter months, time is limited. We don't have a lot of time.
There's a temptation, no doubt, Barkha. There's a temptation immediately to look at military options for retribution and things like that. This is the kind of pressure which will play up from the street levels at all times. But I think the government has to be very pragmatic. We have to see the terminal objectives. We are not looking at a general war. We are not even looking at a border war. But we are definitely looking at the redeeming of our honor. And we are looking at ensuring that the territory which, if there's any territory which is under Chinese occupation, that is vacated well before winter, at the earliest, in fact, in the next few weeks. Having said that, I think the rest of it primarily should be in the economic and the diplomatic domain. And the government will necessarily reach out, will necessarily get engaged with the Chinese and project whatever our intent is. It is very clear that this is not acceptable. This kind of a thing cannot be accepted by the government of India or the people of India. And at the last end of it, if the Chinese are unwilling to bend and if they continue to carry out coercion, then I think when push comes to shove, then India should be prepared for the worst.
General Malik, very quickly, last word from you. When General Hasnain says that at the very least, we need to get our territory back, and that's a no-brainer, we do. And we have a few weeks, maybe a couple of months to do that. What do you do if the Chinese don't respond favorably on that diplomatically? What do you do? What are we doing?
I would totally agree with what Atta has just now mentioned. Okay. But I think we have now reached a stage where we have to review our total policy as far as our relations with China are concerned. I think we have reached a turning in that. And if we don't review it today, I'm sorry, then we are not doing our job. And when I talk of policy, now it means both at the political level, economic level. We have a very large interaction with them at different levels, whether it is geopolitical, our own bilateral, or trade and economic, or military also. So we have to review the whole policy all over again. And of course, the most important issue in that is our national security. That cannot be compromised. No government in India, which part it may be, it cannot compromise on its national interest. And therefore, as long as the boundary remains unresolved and remains as sensitive as it is, and people become angry as they are today, we have to make sure that we have adequate deployment and that we can give them for that if required. I hope that kind of situation doesn't arise, but as I said, we have to be prepared for that while looking at the whole panorama of our relationship with China.
Well, it's a very grim and delicate and sensitive time, and heart goes out especially to the families of the soldiers. This has been one of really the most anguished moments for the Indian military. It's been a pleasure talking to three of the most informed voices on the subject. I've learned a lot. I know our viewers have. General Malik, General Hasnain, Dr. Baru. Such a pleasure to have all of you on this program today. Thank you so much.